Hello, and welcome to the latest in the series of podcasts from Neurodiversity in Business. My name's Dan Harris. I'm the founder and CEO of Neurodiversity in Business, and I'm really delighted today to welcome along Mandy. We'll introduce Mandy in a second. I've been following Mandy for quite a few years, actually, and I'm just so impressed by the work that she does out there in the ND ecosystem around employment rights and helping both corporates understand their obligations, but also the rights that neurodivergent employees have. Mandy Aulak runs Talem Law, and she'll give a far more eloquent introduction to herself now. So I'll pass across to Mandy, and Mandy, really welcome you here today.
Oh, thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you for that lovely introduction. So hello, everyone who's listening out there. As Dan said, I am director and co-founder of Talem Law, which is a virtual law firm that we started pre-pandemic, so back in 2017. And the reason I started the firm, so I was as a lawyer for many years, working in the city, practicing exclusively in employment law. But in 2014, my son started displaying signs which made me want to investigate whether he was on the autistic spectrum. And it was that which led to me eventually co-founding the firm with Sean Kennedy, my business partner. And we specialise in all things employment and special educational needs and disability, which is obviously driven by my personal circumstances. So I like to think that we are experts in disability in the classroom and in the workplace. So it's really a personal reason that's made me want to practice in this area.
Excellent, great. Well, again, welcome. And you know, I brought you into this series because we have seen a significant number of questions and queries from the Neurodiversity in Business membership at the corporate level around what do reasonable adjustments look like? What does the law tell you need to do? But, you know, really importantly, and I value what you're doing out there on social media, you're also very practical and give kind of real world advice, because none of us want a law lecture, and what we get from you is actually real practical advice on kind of how to implement these things. So we'd love to hear a little bit about that, but then also what we're hearing from our individual members, those neurodivergent employees, or equally importantly, those potential employees who may be disenfranchised by our current employment system. We're hearing from them that they don't know how to ask their companies for reasonable adjustments. They don't know what the right way is to kind of broach this topic. So if you're happy to kind of just give us your industry experience, we'd love to benefit from that.
Okay, and I promise it won't be a law lecture. Dan. So the legislation around disability in the workplace has been with us for a long time, since the Disability Discrimination Act and now the Equality Act. And in the 20 or so years that I've been a qualified practicing lawyer, I don't think employers understand really how to make reasonable adjustments, which I know is quite a bold claim, but that's what my personal experience has shown. And you're right when you say that there's difficulty on both sides. So I think there's a lack of understanding from the employer about what exactly is required. And there's also that difficulty from the employee about, should I raise that I have a disability? What are the consequences of me doing that? Now, the reason I think that employees should disclose if they feel comfortable in doing so is that the law is there to protect them. And particularly in relation to reasonable adjustments, if an employee doesn't raise that they have a disability and that they require some adjustments to help them do their work, their employer won't know, and then their employer won't be able to put the adjustments in. And then if there are concerns about their performance, an employer isn't going to understand that it's linked back to the disability. So for employees, there is that huge advantage that if you actually do raise it, you can request reasonable adjustments, whereas if you don't, an employer's not going to know, and it's as simple as that. But I do understand that there is a nervousness about asking for that help, but that's where the law comes in to protect you if you do ask for help.
Right. And can I ask you, Mandy, over the last perhaps 3 or 4 years, would you concur with my assertion, which is individuals, employees have actually become more confident to ask for these adjustments? Because we're definitely seeing within neurodiversity in business that there is a groundswell of greater acceptance and understanding. We're still far away from where we need to be, but I feel like particularly employees coming into the start of their employment life cycle, they're actually more ready to speak up. Do you see that as well?
Yes, I do. I think that particularly in the last few years, people have been much more open about talking about their mental health and other issues. So the stigma around those topics, I mean, there still is a stigma. I don't think we can say that we've moved away from that, but I think that there is a much more of tolerance, and I think the pandemic has sort of taught us all to be a little bit more tolerant and compassionate to each other. So I think that those discussions and that way of working has definitely encouraged people to be more open. Yes, I would agree, but there are, and obviously it's an individual thing, there are going to be people that still feel that maybe they don't see their condition as a disability. Maybe at that time when they're first diagnosed, the diagnosis is really to give them an insight, but actually doesn't manifest itself, also they think at that time in the workplace, so they don't feel the need to disclose it.
Got it.
So
following on from that, then I guess if we talk about the employee first of all, so that's one of the main beneficiaries of NIB. Well, it is the beneficiary of NIB as a charity. So tell us about what the right way is to broach this with the employer, and some just kind of good practice that you've seen from your kind of travels across the country.
Okay, so I've been an employee myself asking for reasonable adjustments, so I know there's no right or wrong way to doing this. I do think that it is useful if you can put it in writing.
Okay.
Rather than have a conversation. I mean, you might feel more comfortable having a conversation first with your line manager, but I think it's always important to actually keep a written record of what you asked for when you asked for it, because I think it holds employers more accountable, that they need to do something when something's in black and white. I think things tend to get done, and also there's less likely to be scope of disagreement about did you raise it or didn't you raise it. So I think it's quite helpful, even if you have these conversations, to follow them up in writing. Usually, and it will depend on the individual and it depend on the size of the organisation, but your line manager is usually the starting point, the person that you would go to. HR, of course, are there as well, and the matter would probably be referred to HR at some point anyway. But I usually think a good starting point is to say to your manager, and follow up with an email saying, look, I wanted to raise this with you. Can we grab some time in the diary, talk them through what's happened, that you may have got this diagnosis, and you do think that there are some adjustments that could be made. The starting point really is, first of all, just to disclose that, and then that leads on to having a discussion about what adjustments you might need, if any. Okay,
got it. And I know from kind of what some of our individual members are telling us, they are resistant to disclose. I mean, let's talk about this. It's quite a contentious topic in our community, neurodiversity versus disability, because unfortunately a lot of big corporates, their HR packages, they're pretty inflexible, and there's a drop down box for disability. Maybe there's something which asks what that kind of disability is. Is neurodiversity a disability? Does it come in a separate category? And you're not going to solve that conundrum here, but interested in your views.
Okay, yes, I know it is a bit of a contentious issue. I use the term disability, which you're probably not surprised to hear, Dan, because I'm a lawyer. I like to look at the wording in the statute. The statute talks about disability. Disability is the label that we place on it, and it refers to mental and physical impairments. And of course, disability is wider than just neurodiverse conditions. So I prefer to use the language in the statute because everyone is very clear then what we are talking about. Disability has certain, when you use that term in the workplace, it will then spark off a certain chain of events because everyone understands, or should understand, particularly if they work in HR, that will mean a protected characteristic. If somebody is able to satisfy the definition of disability, which is a legal one, not a medical one, in Section 6 of the Equality Act, then certain rights and obligations flow from that. And the key one being the obligation on an employer to make reasonable adjustments.
Got it.
So okay. I use the word disability.
Understood. Yeah. And that's you know, that's appropriate in this context, isn't it? And we're not talking about all spheres of society. We're talking here about the legality, so that makes sense to me. So an employee's disclosed, you know, they've got the courage up, they've disclosed, etc. Let's kind of flip the narrative now on what the employer, you know, how does the employer react to this? Because again, some of the members within IB are D&I practitioners, HR professionals, and sometimes I think they tell me they're quite nervous. You know, they don't know exactly what the requirements are upon them. They don't know how reasonable actually is. And indeed, often their businesses are not set up from a functional perspective to always deliver those adjustments on a consistent, reliable and evidence basis. So love to hear a little bit more about that side of it, please.
Yeah, so I mean, my background is that typically I've acted for employers, and I do know that when they have got this information, as you say, they don't always know what to do, and there can be a bit of panic. And I think what makes disability as a protected characteristic unique and the obligation to make reasonable adjustments is that an employer has to do something, whereas we're quite used to, you know, we mustn't directly discriminate, we mustn't indirectly discriminate. They're things that you shouldn't do. But with reasonable adjustments, you actually have to do something. And there's never really been any guidance about how you do that and what approach you should take. And of course, disability, there are so many different conditions out there which would meet the definition of disability. Everyone is unique, so how someone presents at work with their condition is going to be different to someone else, and of course it would depend on how they're disadvantaged as well. So with all of that, it's not surprising that employers do struggle with knowing, well, how do I go about doing this? And I see that all the time, and I've seen that for the last 20 years, and I think sometimes it's just best to boil it down to its essence. Reasonable adjustments are there to what I call level the playing field. Right. The person who has a disability is disadvantaged. And with neurodiverse conditions, because you can't always see that, sometimes employers and other colleagues forget that. So what the label I've always often seen being thrown out is, oh, this is showing favoritism. This is all favoritism. Well, it's not, because a person who's got a disability is starting out at a disadvantage. So this is just about removing or avoiding the disadvantage so that they're on a level playing field. Okay. And there is, I think, a very, what I call a blue sky approach to doing that. So I have seen many employers attempt to do with the best will in the world, but they're very random in their approach. So for example, if somebody has a visual impairment, for example, instead of actually looking at, well, let's look at that person's job, let's look at all of those aspects and go through it methodically, they tend to think big picture, and they'll say, oh, you're visually impaired. Okay, so do we need some software? Okay, great, let's get some software. Do we need to adjust the lighting? Do we need a bigger screen? So they're kind of thinking in that kind of random random way, which means that there's a danger quite often that these adjustments will get missed. And another problem that I also encounter is that even if a proper process hasn't been followed and things are working, when there's a change in management, quite often then a manager will come in and say, well, why are you doing that like that? Not realizing it's an adjustment. And then it's almost like the employee has to start all the way from the beginning. And that can be quite hard for an employee, having to justify what they shouldn't have to already, justify because it's been in place as an adjustment. So there's also an issue there about knowledge transference as well. But I think the how, and just actually having a framework, which is why we have been working on developing an HR process to actually assist employers with that, because I think that has been, in my 20 years experience, where things go wrong.
Got it. Yeah, that's interesting. And then what's your take on the kind of the current thinking around cost effectiveness and degree of success? Because I see a lot of kind of concern that some of the reasonable adjustments that neurodivergent employees are asking for, HR and maybe even IT, they worry that they're going to be systemic, deep, they're going to be incredibly difficult to implement. But actually, you then talk to the employee and the employees know, I need something simple. I need noise cancelling headphones and some appreciation that sometimes I need a slightly different way of working, a cultural awareness piece. So just tell me about the cost effectiveness element of that.
Okay, so reasonable adjustments, as the name says, is about what is reasonable, and what is reasonable will depend on the individual circumstances. And I have often seen this over the years where automatically a barrier goes up. Oh, these are going to be costly. But actually, when you sit down, and this is why the whole how do you do this piece is so important. And it's important, I think, to recognise that the process of reasonable adjustments, yes, it is an obligation on the employer, but the employee also has a part to play in that, because they know where they're disadvantaged, and they will have ideas about what else can be suggested. So I do consider it to be a dialogue between employer and employee. And obviously what's expected of a big employer will be very different from a small family run business, and of course you will only look at adjustments that are going to be effective. There's no point in having an adjustment if it's not going to make any difference. But very often, in my experience, it's the most simple, really cheap adjustments that are the most effective. It's not very often that you're looking at spending thousands of pounds on getting equipment in. It's quite often the small things, as you said, the cultural piece, maybe recognizing there needs to be, hot desking doesn't work for some employees. They might need to have a dedicated office to do certain tasks to keep them on track. There's sort of small things which are more organisational and about being organised.
Yeah, well, no, that really rings true with what our members are saying, and it's interesting to see how we're kind of trying to lessen the divide between those two expectations. I'd just like to conclude a little bit with highlighting to our membership around what you do out there on social media, because the reason I've invited you along today is that I see you put a lot of free stuff out there, which is to the benefit of both employer and employee. So tell us a little bit about your style on social media and what the name is on LinkedIn for people to look out for you on.
Okay, well, thank you for first of all noticing my posts on LinkedIn. I do have quite a visual style. I aim to make the law as simple as possible, because something like disability, discrimination in the workplace, it can all seem quite overwhelming. And actually, as I said, at core, it's really simple. So these ideas, I want to make them more easily to digest, because if you get this right, so for example, I write a lot about reasonable adjustments. If you get this right, it is a win-win for both employer and employee. Employers invest a lot in their employees, you know, from the recruitment stage to advertising, getting them on board. And it's not just a salary costs that are invested in employees, it's everything else around it, their training and so on. So they don't want to lose these people who they've had to, you know, struggle to get on board. So just engaging in this process and understanding it and not being scared of it and realizing it's not that complicated makes, you know, is a win-win for employer and employee, because of course an employee wants to thrive in the workplace, and that's what an employer wants. So you're all working towards the same goal, and it's about recognizing that. And my style of doing this on social media, I've got a nickname now. Apparently I'm called the Comic Queen, because I do try and convey these ideas through the use of comics, because we can all relate to a story. Everyone likes a story. So if you can try and get those ideas across in an amusing way. It's always done with a, you know, slight tongue in cheek as well. You know, people know I put myself in these comics, but it makes it just more accessible for people to grapple with. And I do write a lot about particularly reasonable adjustments. Of course, disability is not just about reasonable adjustments, but that's what we focus on, because in my experience, and I've been an in-house lawyer over this time as well, that's the one area that is most disputed. You know,
right.
People understand harassment, they understand victimization. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, of course, but it's reasonable adjustments that tends to be the most, you know, difficult area where there are more complaints. So I tend to really sort of focus on that, and also just raising awareness, because some people also assume that if they've got a diagnosis, for example, of ADHD, that automatically means that they've got a disability for the purposes of the Equality Act. And actually, conditions like ASC, ADHD, still have to go through the hoops of satisfying that definition. It's only things like HIV or cancer which are automatically deemed disabilities. Right. So it's just, for me, it's about getting that awareness out there, doing it in a memorable way. I'm a visual learner myself, and because I have an autistic son, I know he learns visually, and that sort of has reinforced to me actually that's quite a powerful way of getting your message across. So I try and use visuals, and visual legal design is quite a big thing in the legal community at the moment. So I'm using a lot of those concepts as well in how I broadcast my message out there on social media.
Great. Well, I can say this on behalf of our membership. Thank you, Mandy. What you and Sean do in Talem Law is really appreciated. And thank you. I hope this has been as useful and insightful for our membership as it has been for me. Really enjoyed getting to know you a little bit more. And, you know, in the months and years ahead, we'd be delighted to have you back on as and when we hear additional hot topics from our membership. So thank you, Mandy. Have a lovely day. And to everyone who's listening and watching, we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.